Ezekiel "Zeke" Hawthorne was a name that resonated in the tech world. Known for his brilliance in cybersecurity, he was the kind of person who could see vulnerabilities in systems that others couldn't even imagine. At just 32, Zeke had already made a name for himself as the lead developer at Arctis Systems, one of the most powerful tech corporations in Seattle. Arctis was a giant in the industry, specializing in data security, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure. Zeke had been instrumental in designing their flagship product, Sentinel, a state-of-the-art data monitoring and protection system used by governments and corporations worldwide. It was a system so advanced that it was said to be unhackable, at least that's what Zeke had believed. Zeke's life revolved around his work. He spent long hours in the sleek, glass-walled offices of Arctis, poring over lines of code and brainstorming with his team. He was meticulous, driven, and fiercely loyal to his craft. Outside of work, his life was simple. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, where his only companion was his dog, Ragnar, a Belgian Malinois with sharp instincts and an unwavering loyalty to his owner. Ragnar had been with Zeke for years, a constant source of comfort in a world that often felt cold and impersonal. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Zeke's world began to unravel. He was at his desk, finishing up some final tweaks to a new update for Sentinel, when his phone buzzed. It was a notification from the company's internal security system, a breach. Zeke's heart sank. A breach in Sentinel was unthinkable. He immediately accessed the system logs, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he tried to trace the source of the attack. The breach was massive, targeting sensitive data from several high-profile clients. Whoever was behind it had managed to bypass multiple layers of encryption, something Zeke had thought was impossible. As he worked, a sense of unease crept over him. The attack was sophisticated, too sophisticated. It was as if the hacker knew Sentinel's architecture intimately, exploiting vulnerabilities that only someone with insider knowledge could have known. Zeke's mind raced. Could it be someone from his team? Or worse, could it be someone higher up in the company? He dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it came. Arctis was his home, his family. The idea of betrayal from within was unthinkable. But then, things took a darker turn. As Zeke delved deeper into the logs, he noticed something strange. The digital fingerprints of the attack, the IP addresses, the access points, the timestamps, were all pointing back to him. His personal workstation, his credentials, his encrypted keys. It was as if he had orchestrated the entire breach himself. Zeke froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This had to be a mistake, or worse, a setup. Before he could act, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Eleanor Voss, the head of Arctis's legal department. Her voice was cold and clipped. "Zeke, we need you in the conference room, now." Zeke's stomach churned as he made his way to the room. When he arrived, he was met with a wall of stern faces. Eleanor was there, along with several members of the company's executive team, and two men in suits who introduced themselves as agents from the Federal Cybersecurity Task Force. The air was thick with tension. "Ezekiel Hawthorne," one of the agents began, "you are under investigation for the unauthorized breach of Arctis Systems' data infrastructure and the theft of classified information." Zeke's heart pounded in his chest. "What? No, that's impossible. I didn't—" Eleanor cut him off. "Zeke, the evidence is overwhelming. The breach originated from your workstation. Your credentials were used to access the data. And," she hesitated, her eyes narrowing, "there's also the matter of the money." "The money?" Zeke echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. The agent nodded grimly. "A series of transactions were made to an offshore account in your name, millions of dollars transferred just hours after the breach." Zeke felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He shook his head vehemently. No, this is wrong. I didn't do this. Someone's framing me." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Zeke, we've worked together for years. I want to believe you, but the evidence is damning. Until we can sort this out, you're suspended from your position, effective immediately." The agent stepped forward. "Mr. Hawthorne, we're going to need you to come with us." Panic surged through Zeke. "Wait, you have to believe me. I've been set up. Check the logs, the deeper logs. There's no way I could have done this." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The agents placed him in handcuffs and began to lead him out of the building. As he was escorted through the halls, his colleagues stared, their faces a mix of shock and pity. Zeke felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. How had it come to this? When they arrived at his house, the agents conducted a thorough search, confiscating his computers, hard drives, and any other electronic devices. Ragnar barked furiously, pacing back and forth as the strangers invaded their home. Zeke tried to calm him, but his own anxiety was palpable. One of the agents found a folder on Zeke's personal laptop containing encrypted files. "What's this?" the agent asked, holding up the laptop. "I don't know," Zeke replied honestly. "I've never seen those files before." The agent's expression was skeptical. "Convenient." As the search continued, Zeke sat on the couch, his hands cuffed in front of him. Ragnar sat at his feet, his head resting on Zeke's knee. The dog's presence was a small comfort in an otherwise nightmarish situation. Finally, the agents announced that they were taking Zeke into custody. As they led him out of the house, Ragnar barked and lunged, trying to follow. Zeke turned back, his voice breaking. "Stay, Ragnar. Stay with Mara." Mara was his neighbor and close friend, someone he trusted to take care of Ragnar in his absence. The last thing Zeke saw as he was pushed into the back of the car was Ragnar, standing in the doorway, his ears perked and his eyes filled with confusion. Zeke's heart ached. He had no idea when, or if, he would see his loyal companion again. As the car pulled away, Zeke's mind raced. He was innocent, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously, leaving no room for doubt. But Zeke knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them win. He would find a way to prove his innocence no matter what it took. For now, though, all he could do was sit in silence, the weight of the accusations pressing down on him like a physical burden. Ragnar's bark echoed in his ears, a reminder of the life he was leaving behind and the fight that lay ahead. The cold, sterile air of the federal prison clung to Ezekiel's Zeke Hawthorne like a second skin. The clang of metal doors and the distant murmur of other inmates were constant reminders of where he was. It had been 3 days since his arrest, and the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He sat on the edge of the thin mattress in his cell, staring at the gray concrete walls. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led him here, the breach, the accusations, the evidence. It all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Zeke's only solace was the thought of Ragnar, his loyal dog, now in the care of Mara. Mara had been his neighbor and closest friend for years. She was the only person he trusted, the only one who might believe him. He had managed to get a message to her through his court-appointed lawyer, asking her to visit. Now, he waited, hoping she would come. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the jingle of keys. A guard appeared at the door of his cell. "Hawthorne, you've got a visitor," the guard said gruffly. Zeke stood, his heart pounding. He followed the guard down a series of hallways until they reached the visitation room. The room was divided by a thick pane of glass, with telephones on either side for communication. Zeke's eyes immediately found Mara, sitting on the other side of the glass. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her face was a mixture of concern and determination. Zeke picked up the phone, and Mara did the same. "Zeke," she said, her voice soft but steady, "are you okay?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look okay, Mara? I'm in prison for something I didn't do." "I know," she said quickly. "I know you didn't do it. That's why I'm here." Zeke felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're the only one who believes me." "Of course I believe you," Mara replied. "I've known you for years. You're not capable of what they're accusing you of. But Zeke, the evidence, it's bad. They've got your credentials, your workstation logs, even bank transfers in your name. It's like they've built an airtight case against you." Zeke leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "That's because it's a setup, Mara. Someone at Arctis is framing me. They had access to everything, my credentials, my systems. They knew exactly how to make it look like I was the one behind the breach." Mara nodded, her expression serious. "I believe you, but proving it is going to be hard. The authorities aren't exactly looking for alternative explanations." "That's why I need your help," Zeke said. "I need you to dig into this. Start with Arctis. Look into the breach, the logs, anything that seems off. Someone there is behind this, I'm sure of it." Mara hesitated. "Zeke, I'm not a hacker or a tech genius like you. I wouldn't even know where to start." "You don't have to be," Zeke said. "Just start asking questions. Talk to people. Look for anything unusual. And keep an eye on Ragnar for me. He's all I've got left." Mara smiled faintly. "Ragnar's fine. He misses you, though. He keeps sitting by the door, waiting for you to come home." Zeke's chest tightened at the thought of his dog. "Tell him I'll be back. I don't know how, but I'll find a way." Mara's eyes softened. "I will, And I'll do whatever I can to help you, Zeke. I promise. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging between them. Finally, Mara spoke again. Zeke, do you have any idea who might be behind this? Anyone at Arctis who would want to frame you? Zeke shook his head. I've been racking my brain, but I can't think of anyone. I mean, there's always office politics, but nothing that would lead to this. Whoever did this isn't just trying to get rid of me. They're covering something up, something big. Mara frowned. What do you mean? Think about it, Zeke said. Why go to all this trouble to frame me? Why not just fire me or discredit me some other way? No, this is about more than just me. They're hiding something, and they needed a scapegoat. I was convenient. Mara's expression hardened. Then we'll find out what it is. I'll start digging and I'll let you know if I find anything. Zeke nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Thank you, Mara. I don't know what I'd do without you. You don't have to thank me, she said. You'd do the same for me. The guard appeared at the door, signaling that their time was up. Zeke felt a pang of frustration. There was so much more he wanted to say, so much more he needed to figure out. But for now, he had to trust Mara. Take care of yourself, Zeke, Mara said as she stood. And don't lose hope. We'll get through this. Zeke managed a small smile. Take care of Ragnar. And be careful, Mara. Whoever did this won't want you poking around. I'll be careful, she promised. Stay strong. As she walked away, Zeke felt a mix of gratitude and despair. He was grateful to have someone like Mara on his side, but the enormity of the task ahead was overwhelming. He returned to his cell, his mind racing with possibilities. Who at Arctis could have done this? And what were they trying to hide? That night, as he lay on the hard mattress, staring at the ceiling, Zeke made a decision. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let his life be destroyed by lies and manipulation. He would find a way to prove his innocence, no matter how long it took or how hard it was. For now, though, all he could do was wait. Wait for Mara to uncover the first thread of the truth. Wait for the chance to fight back, and wait for the day he could finally go home to Ragnar. As the lights in the prison dimmed, Zeke closed his eyes, his resolve hardening. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The news came early in the morning, delivered by a guard with a gruff voice and an indifferent expression. Hawthorne, the guard barked, rapping on the bars of Zeke's cell. Pack your things, you're being transferred. Zeke sat up on his cot, his heart sinking. Transferred? To where? High security facility, the guard replied, not bothering to look at him. You'll be leaving tomorrow morning. Zeke's stomach churned. A high-security prison meant even less freedom, even fewer resources to fight his case. It was a death sentence for any hope he had of proving his innocence. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts. Do I get a final request? Zeke asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The guard shrugged. Depends on what it is. Don't get your hopes up. Zeke didn't hesitate. I want to see my dog. I want to see Ragnar. The guard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Your dog? That's your big request? Yes, Zeke said firmly. I want to see him before I go. The guard muttered something under his breath, but eventually nodded. I'll let the warden know. Don't expect miracles, though. As the guard walked away, Zeke leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. Seeing Ragnar one last time was the only thing he could think of to give him some semblance of peace before the transfer. But more than that, he needed to see Mara. He needed to know if she'd found anything, if there was any progress in uncovering the truth. The next day, Zeke was escorted to the visitation area. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and 2 guards flanked him as they walked. The room was the same as before, divided by a thick pane of glass. But this time, when Zeke entered, his heart leapt. On the other side of the glass, Mara was sitting with Ragnar at her feet. The sight of his dog made Zeke's chest tighten. Ragnar's ears perked up the moment he saw Zeke, and the dog let out an excited bark, his tail wagging furiously. Zeke picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. Mara did the same, a small smile on her face. Hey, Zeke, she said softly. I brought him. Thank you, Zeke said, his voice thick with emotion. You have no idea how much this means to me. Ragnar pressed his nose against the glass, whining softly. Zeke placed his hand on the glass, wishing he could reach through and touch him. Hey, buddy, he said, his voice breaking. I missed you. He misses you too, Mara said. He's been restless ever since you've been gone. Zeke nodded, swallowing hard. How's he been? Is he eating? Sleeping? He's fine, Mara assured him. He's a little confused, but he's okay. He's strong, just like you. Zeke managed a small smile. I don't feel very strong right now. You are, Mara said firmly, and we're going to get through this. I've been looking into Arctis like you asked. I don't have much yet, but I found something interesting. Zeke's eyes narrowed. What is it? Mara glanced around, lowering her voice even though no one could hear her through the glass. I'll explain later, just pay attention to Ragnar. Zeke frowned, confused. What do you mean? Just trust me, Mara said, her tone insistent. Look at his collar. Zeke's gaze shifted to Ragnar's collar. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. But then, as Ragnar moved, something small and metallic caught the light. Zeke's heart skipped a beat. There, attached to the inside of the collar, was a tiny USB drive. His mind raced. Mara must have found something. Something important enough to risk smuggling it into the prison. He forced himself to stay calm, his expression neutral. Mara, he said slowly, thank you for bringing him. It means everything to me. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. I know. Just take care of yourself, okay? I will, Zeke said. And thank you for everything. The guard behind Zeke cleared his throat. Time's up. Zeke's chest tightened. He didn't want to leave, didn't want to say goodbye. But he knew he had no choice. He stood, giving Ragnar one last look. Be good, buddy, he said softly. I'll see you again, I promise. Ragnar barked, his tail wagging as if he understood. Zeke turned and followed the guards out of the room, his mind racing. The USB drive was small enough to hide, but he needed to act fast. As they walked back to his cell, Zeke stumbled slightly, using the moment to slip his hand into Ragnar's collar and retrieve the drive. He clenched it tightly in his fist, his heart pounding. When they reached his cell, Zeke sat on the cot, his back to the guards. He slipped the USB drive into the hem of his sleeve, hiding it as best he could. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. What had Mara found, and how could he access it without arousing suspicion? That night, as the prison lights dimmed, Zeke lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the USB drive in his sleeve was both a comfort and a burden. It was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But it was also a risk. If the guards found it, he could lose everything. Still, Zeke knew one thing for certain. Mara wouldn't have gone to such lengths if it wasn't important. Whatever was on that drive, it was the key to uncovering the truth. And Zeke was determined to find out what it was. As he closed his eyes, he thought of Ragnar, of Mara, of the life he'd been ripped away from. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. Back in his cell, Zeke sat on the edge of his cot, his heart pounding as he carefully retrieved the USB drive from the hem of his sleeve. The tiny device felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of his entire future. He glanced toward the small, outdated computer in the corner of his cell. It was a relic, barely functional, but it was all he had. The prison allowed inmates limited access to computers for basic tasks, and Zeke had been using it to draft notes for his defense. Now, it would serve a far more critical purpose. He glanced toward the hallway, listening for the sound of approaching guards. The corridor was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of other inmates. Zeke took a deep breath, then moved to the computer. He inserted the USB drive into the port, his hands trembling slightly. The screen flickered as the device was recognized, and a single folder appeared labeled Evidence. Zeke's pulse quickened. He opened the folder, revealing a series of files, text documents, code snippets, and encrypted logs. He clicked on the first file, a text document titled Setup_log1. As the file opened, his eyes scanned the contents and his stomach dropped. The document detailed a series of actions taken to fabricate evidence against him. It included timestamps, IP addresses, and access logs, all pointing to his workstation. But what caught Zeke's attention was a line of code embedded in the document. It was a script designed to mimic his credentials and activity on the Arctis systems network. Whoever had written it had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look like Zeke was the perpetrator. This is insane, Zeke muttered under his breath. His mind raced as he opened the next file, a log labeled Project_Spectre. The name sent a chill down his spine. He had heard whispers of Project Spectre during his time at Arctis, but it had always been shrouded in secrecy. Now, as he read through the document, the truth began to unfold. Project Spectre was a covert system developed by Arctis to manipulate and fabricate digital evidence. It was designed to target individuals, creating false trails that could be used to discredit or incriminate them. The logs revealed that Zeke wasn't the first victim. Several other employees had been framed and quietly removed from the company, their reputations destroyed. The system was a weapon, and Zeke had been its latest target. Unbelievable, Zeke whispered, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. They've been doing this for years. He opened another file, this one labeled Targets. His name was at the top of the list, along with a brief description. Hawthorne, Ezekiel, lead developer, potential liability, remove. Below his name were others, some he recognized, others he didn't. Each entry included a similar description, outlining why the individual had been targeted. Zeke leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. This was it. This was the proof he needed to clear his name, but it was also dangerous. If Arctis found out that Mara had smuggled this to him, she could be in serious trouble. He needed to act quickly and carefully. He opened the final file, a heavily encrypted document labeled Spectre_Protocol. It appeared to be the blueprint for the entire system, detailing how it operated and how it could be dismantled. Zeke's eyes scanned the code, his mind working at lightning speed. He recognized some of the architecture. It was based on systems he had helped design. The realization made his stomach churn. They had used his own work to build this monstrosity. As he worked, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Zeke froze, his heart pounding. He quickly minimized the screen and turned off the monitor, pretending to be writing notes. A guard passed by, glancing into the cell but saying nothing. Zeke waited until the footsteps faded, then turned the monitor back on. He knew he couldn't keep the USB drive. If the guards found it during a search, it would be confiscated, and he would lose everything. He needed to get the information to Mara, but he couldn't risk sending the USB itself. Instead, he decided to encrypt the most critical files and send them to her in a coded message. Zeke opened a blank document and began typing. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he crafted a message to Mara, explaining what he had found and what she needed to do. He kept the language vague, knowing that the prison monitored all outgoing communications. The real message was hidden in the encryption, a series of numbers and letters that only Mara would understand. Mara, I found something. It's bigger than I thought. Arctis has been using a system to frame people, and I'm just one of many. The files on this drive prove it. I've encrypted the most important ones and included instructions for decrypting them. You'll need help, someone who knows how to handle this kind of thing. Find a lawyer, someone you trust. This is the key to clearing my name. Be careful. If they find out you have this, they won't hesitate to come after you. Trust no one except the lawyer. And take care of Ragnar for me. Zeke. Once the message was complete, Zeke encrypted the files and embedded them into the document. He saved it to the prison's shared drive, where inmates could store personal files, and marked it as a draft email. He would send it during his next scheduled computer session, ensuring it reached Mara without drawing suspicion. As he finished, Zeke leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. The weight of what he had discovered was overwhelming, but it also gave him a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like he had a fighting chance. He removed the USB drive from the computer and stared at it for a moment. It was such a small thing, yet it held the power to bring down an entire corporation. Zeke knew he couldn't keep it. He would have to destroy it, ensuring that no one else could trace it back to Mara. He stood and walked to the small sink in his cell, holding the drive over the drain. "Goodbye," he muttered, dropping the drive into the sink and turning on the water. The tiny device disappeared down the drain, leaving no trace behind. Zeke sat back down on his cot, his mind racing. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long and dangerous. He didn't know if Mara would be able to find a lawyer, or if the files would be enough to expose Arctis, but he had to believe. He had to trust that the truth would come to light. As the lights in the prison dimmed, signaling the end of the day, Zeke lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a chance, and that was enough to keep him going. Mara sat in the corner booth of a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She glanced at the door every few seconds, her nerves on edge. She had spent the last 2 days researching lawyers, trying to find someone who could help Zeke. Most of the names she came across were either too expensive or too unwilling to take on a case as complicated as his. But then she found Callum Drake. Callum was a name that carried weight in the legal world. He was known for taking on impossible cases, particularly those involving wrongful convictions. His reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried, had earned him both respect and enemies. Mara had reached out to him, explaining Zeke's situation in vague terms, and to her surprise, he had agreed to meet. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Mara's head snapped up. A tall man in his late 40s walked in, his sharp gray suit contrasting with the casual atmosphere of the cafe. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room until they landed on Mara. He approached her table with a confident stride. "Mara, I presume?" he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Yes," Mara said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." Callum nodded and slid into the seat across from her. "You said this was about a friend of yours, Ezekiel Hawthorne, accused of a cybercrime, correct?" Mara nodded, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. "Yes, Zeke's been framed. He's innocent, but the evidence against him is overwhelming. I need your help to prove it." Callum leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Framed, you say? That's a serious accusation. Do you have anything to back it up?" Mara hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from her bag. Inside was a printed copy of the encrypted files Zeke had sent her, along with a handwritten note explaining what she had found. She slid it across the table to Callum. "This is what Zeke managed to get to me," she said. "It's proof that Arctis Systems, the company he worked for, has been using a secret system to frame people. They call it Project Spectre. They used it to fabricate evidence against Zeke, and he's not the only one. There are others." Callum opened the envelope and scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. After a few moments, he looked up. "This is interesting. If what these files say is true, then Arctis is running a highly illegal operation. But this isn't enough. These documents are a start, but they won't hold up in court on their own. We'll need more, much more." Mara nodded, her heart sinking slightly. "I was afraid you'd say that. What do we do?" Callum set the papers down and folded his hands on the table. "First, we need to verify the authenticity of these files. If they're legitimate, then we'll use them as a foundation to dig deeper into Arctis. I'll need access to Zeke's case files, his work history, and any other information you can provide, and we'll need to find someone who can corroborate his story, someone on the inside, if possible." Mara frowned. "An insider? That won't be easy. Arctis is a fortress. They don't let information slip out, and anyone who tries to speak up usually disappears, figuratively at least." Callum's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's why we'll have to be careful. But I've dealt with corporations like this before. They all have weak points. We just have to find them." Mara took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of hope. "Okay, where do we start?" Callum tapped the papers in front of him. "With this, I'll have my team analyze the files and see if we can trace their origin. In the meantime, I want you to tell me everything you know about Zeke's work at Arctis, any projects he was involved in, any colleagues he mentioned, anything that seemed off." Mara nodded, her mind racing. Zeke worked on a lot of high-level projects, but the one he was most proud of was Sentinel, their flagship data security system. He said it was supposed to be unhackable, but after the breach, he started to suspect that someone inside the company had compromised it. He thought it might have been tied to something bigger, but he didn't have proof. Callum's eyes narrowed. "Sentinel, you say? That could be important. If Sentinel was compromised, it might be connected to this Project Spectre. I'll look into it." Mara hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing. Zeke mentioned a name, SpectreNet. I don't know what it is, but it sounds like it might be related." Callum's expression darkened. "SpectreNet. That sounds like a system, possibly the backbone of Project Spectre. If we can find it, we might be able to expose everything." Mara leaned forward, her voice urgent. "How do we find it?" Callum shook his head. "That's the tricky part. If SpectreNet exists, it's likely buried deep within Arctis's infrastructure. We'll need someone with technical expertise to access it, someone who knows their systems as well as Zeke does." Mara's heart sank. "Zeke's the only one who could do that, and he's in prison." Callum gave her a reassuring look. "Don't worry, we'll figure something out. For now, focus on gathering as much information as you can. Talk to anyone who might know something, even if it seems insignificant. Sometimes the smallest details can break a case wide open." Mara nodded, determination hardening in her chest. "I'll do whatever it takes." Callum stood, gathering the papers and slipping them into his briefcase. "Good. I'll be in touch once I've reviewed these files. And Mara, be careful. If Arctis is as dangerous as you say, they won't take kindly to us poking around." "I will," Mara promised. Thank you, Callum, for helping Zeke. Callum gave her a small nod. I'm not doing this for Zeke. I'm doing this because if what you're saying is true, then Arctis is a threat to more than just him. They need to be stopped. With that, he turned and left the cafe, leaving Mara alone with her thoughts. She sat there for a moment, staring at her cold coffee before pulling out her phone. She had work to do. Over the next few days, Callum and Mara worked tirelessly. Callum's team analyzed the files from the USB drive, confirming their authenticity and uncovering more details about SpectreNet. It was a sophisticated system designed to manipulate data on a massive scale. It could fabricate evidence, erase digital footprints, and create false narratives, all with a few keystrokes. This isn't just a tool for framing people, Callum said during one of their meetings. This is a weapon. Arctis could use this to control anyone, politicians, corporations, even governments. If we don't stop them, there's no telling how far they'll go. Mara shuddered at the thought. So what do we do? Callum leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. We need more evidence. The files Zeke sent us are damning, but they're not enough to take down a corporation like Arctis. We need something concrete, something that ties SpectreNet directly to their leadership. Mara frowned. Zeke mentioned that he kept backups of his work. He said he always made copies of important files just in case. Maybe there's something in those backups that can help. Callum's eyes lit up. If those backups exist, they could be the key to everything. Do you know where he kept them? Mara hesitated. He didn't tell me. Mara sat on the floor of her apartment, staring at Ragnar as he lay sprawled out on the rug, his tail thumping lazily against the floor. She had been racking her brain for days, trying to figure out where Zeke might have hidden his backups. He had always been meticulous, always one step ahead, but he hadn't told her where he kept them. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Ragnar, she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. The dog perked up at the sound of his name, his ears twitching. You were always with him. You know him better than anyone. Where would he go? Ragnar tilted his head as if he understood her words. Mara let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I'm losing it, talking to a dog like he's going to answer me. But then, as she looked at him, an idea began to form. Ragnar had been Zeke's constant companion, following him everywhere. If anyone or anything knew Zeke's habits, it was Ragnar. Maybe, just maybe, Ragnar could lead her to something Zeke had left behind. Mara stood and grabbed Ragnar's leash. All right, boy, she said, her voice firm. Let's see if you can help me. Ragnar jumped to his feet, his tail wagging excitedly. Mara clipped the leash onto his collar and grabbed her bag, which contained a flashlight, a notebook, and a small toolkit, just in case. She had no idea where they were going, but she was willing to follow Ragnar's instincts. They started at Zeke's old apartment, which had been sealed off by the authorities after his arrest. Mara stood outside the building, staring up at the windows. Ragnar sniffed around the sidewalk, his nose working furiously. After a few moments, he tugged on the leash, pulling Mara toward the street. All right, she muttered, following him. Where are we going? Ragnar led her through the city, his pace steady and determined. Mara followed, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and uncertainty. They walked for nearly an hour, moving farther and farther from the city center. The buildings grew smaller, the streets quieter, until they reached the outskirts of Seattle. Ragnar stopped in front of a chain-link fence surrounding an old abandoned warehouse. The building was large and weathered, its windows covered in grime. Mara frowned, looking up at the structure. This is it? She asked, glancing down at Ragnar. The dog barked once, his tail wagging. Mara hesitated. The warehouse looked like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it felt familiar. Zeke had mentioned working in a place like this when he was younger, back when he was freelancing and taking odd jobs to make ends meet. Could this be one of the places he had used? She pushed open the gate, which creaked loudly in protest, and stepped inside the property. Ragnar trotted ahead, his nose to the ground. Mara followed him to a side door which was slightly ajar. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out her flashlight and stepped inside. The air inside the warehouse was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of rust and mildew. Dust motes floated in the beam of her flashlight as she swept it across the room. The space was filled with old equipment, broken furniture, and stacks of wooden pallets. Ragnar moved confidently through the clutter, his nose leading him deeper into the building. Zeke, what were you doing here? Mara whispered to herself as she followed the dog. Ragnar stopped in front of a large metal cabinet in the corner of the warehouse. He barked once, then sat down, looking up at Mara expectantly. She frowned, shining her flashlight on the cabinet. It was old and rusted, but the lock on the door looked relatively new. Mara knelt down, inspecting the lock. It was a simple padlock, nothing too complicated. She pulled out her toolkit and got to work, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. After a few minutes, the lock clicked open, and she pulled the cabinet door wide. Inside, she found a small fireproof safe. Her heart skipped a beat. This had to be it. She examined the safe, searching for a way to open it. There was a keypad on the front, and she bit her lip trying to think. Zeke would have used a code that meant something to him, something personal. "All right, Zeke," she muttered. "What would you use?" She tried a few combinations. His birthday, Ragnar's name, even the date he had started working at Arctis. Nothing worked. Frustrated, she sat back on her heels, staring at the safe. Ragnar whined softly, nudging her arm with his nose. Mara looked at him, a thought suddenly striking her. "Wait a second," she said. "What if it's—" She typed in the date Zeke had adopted Ragnar, a date she knew he cherished. The keypad beeped, and the safe clicked open. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and pulled the door open. Inside was a single external hard drive, carefully wrapped in a protective case. Mara picked it up, her hands trembling. This was it. This was what Zeke had hidden. "Good boy, Ragnar," she said, scratching the dog behind his ears. He barked happily, his tail wagging. Back at her apartment, Mara connected the hard drive to her laptop, her heart pounding. The drive was encrypted, but Zeke had included a text file with instructions on how to access the data. She followed the steps carefully, entering the decryption key he had provided in the files he sent her earlier. When the drive finally opened, Mara's screen was flooded with folders and files. She clicked on the first folder labeled Spectre Evidence and began to read. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents. There were emails, internal memos, and system logs, all pointing to the existence of SpectreNet. The files detailed how Arctis had used the system to frame employees, manipulate data, and cover up illegal activities. One file in particular caught her attention. It was a memo from one of Arctis's executives, discussing the need to neutralize Zeke after he began asking too many questions about Sentinel. The memo explicitly stated that SpectreNet had been used to fabricate evidence against him. "This is it," Mara whispered, her voice trembling. "This is the proof." She continued to dig through the files, finding more and more damning evidence. There were even records of payments made to third parties to carry out the framing of employees. It was a web of corruption, and Zeke had been caught in the middle of it. Mara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She needed to get this to Callum. With this hard drive, they had everything they needed to expose Arctis and clear Zeke's name. She looked down at Ragnar, who was lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. "You did it, boy," she said, smiling. "You found it." Ragnar thumped his tail against the floor as if he understood. Mara reached down to scratch his ears, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, she felt like they had a real chance. With the hard drive in hand, they could finally bring the truth to light. The tension in Callum's office was palpable. Mara sat across from him, the hard drive resting on the desk between them like a ticking time bomb. Callum leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the files on his laptop. The evidence was damning. Emails, logs, and internal memos that painted a clear picture of Arctis Systems' corruption. SpectreNet wasn't just a tool for manipulation. It was a weapon, and Zeke had been one of its many victims. "This is it," Callum said finally, his voice calm but firm. "This is enough to bring them down." Mara exhaled, relief washing over her. "So what do we do now?" Callum closed his laptop and leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "We go public. We send this to every major news outlet, every regulatory agency, and every law enforcement body that will listen. Arctis won't be able to bury this once it's out in the open." Mara nodded, her determination hardening. "Let's do it. The world needs to know what they've done." Callum gave her a small smile. "It won't be easy. Arctis will fight back. They'll try to discredit us, bury the evidence, maybe even come after us directly. Are you ready for that?" Mara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I don't care what they do to me. Zeke's life is on the line. I'm not backing down." Callum's smile widened slightly. "Good. Then let's get to work." Over the next 24 hours, Callum and his team worked tirelessly to compile the evidence into a comprehensive report. They drafted press releases, prepared encrypted copies of the files, and reached out to trusted contacts in the media and government. Mara stayed by Callum's side, helping wherever she could. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against the clock. By the following morning, the first wave of emails had been sent. Journalists, investigators, and government officials across the country now had access to the files. Mara watched as Callum hit send on the final batch, her heart pounding. "It's done," Callum said, leaning back in his chair. "Now we wait." Mara nodded, but her nerves were far from settled. "What do you think Arctis will do?" Callum's expression darkened. "They'll panic, and when corporations like Arctis panic, they get dangerous." Meanwhile, at Arctis Systems headquarters, the panic Callum had predicted was already in full swing. In a sleek, glass-walled conference room, the company's top executives sat around a long table, their faces pale and tense. On the screen at the front of the room, a live feed of news coverage played, detailing the allegations against the company. "This is a disaster," one executive muttered, running a hand through his hair. "If this gets any bigger, we're finished." Another executive, a woman with sharp features and a cold demeanor, spoke up. "We need to act now. Use SpecterNet to erase everything. Logs, emails, backups. If there's no evidence, they can't prove anything." The CEO, a tall man with graying hair and a steely gaze, nodded. "Do it. Wipe everything. And find out who leaked this. I want them dealt with." Within minutes, Arctis's IT team was mobilized. SpecterNet, the very system they had used to frame Zeke and countless others, was now being deployed to cover their tracks. Servers were purged, files were deleted, and digital trails were erased. The company was in full damage control mode. Back in prison, Zeke sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the small, outdated computer in the corner of his cell. He had been following the news as best he could, and he knew that Mara and Callum had gone public with the evidence. He also knew that Arctis wouldn't go down without a fight. A guard walked by, glancing into Zeke's cell. "You've been quiet today, Hawthorne. Something on your mind?" Zeke gave the guard a faint smile. "Just thinking." The guard snorted and moved on, leaving Zeke alone with his thoughts. He turned back to the computer, his fingers tapping idly on the desk. He had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it ever since he first suspected that Arctis might turn SpecterNet against him. What no one at Arctis knew, what even Mara and Callum didn't know, was that Zeke had built a failsafe into SpecterNet. It was a small piece of code, hidden deep within the system, designed to activate only under specific conditions. He had called it the trigger. The trigger was a restoration protocol, a way to undo the damage SpecterNet had caused. It would recover deleted files, restore corrupted data, and expose every action the system had ever taken. But activating it wasn't easy. Zeke had designed it to require a specific sequence of commands, entered from a secure terminal. And now, with Arctis scrambling to erase their tracks, it was time to use it. Zeke stood and walked to the computer, his heart pounding. He logged in and opened a secure terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The commands came back to him easily, like muscle memory. He had written this code himself, after all. As he worked, the screen filled with lines of text, the system coming to life. Zeke's lips curved into a small, triumphant smile. "You thought you could erase everything," he muttered under his breath, "but you didn't count on me." At the same time, Mara and Callum were watching the news in Callum's office. The story was spreading like wildfire, with more and more outlets picking up the allegations against Arctis. But Mara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "They're too quiet," she said, pacing the room. "Arctis should be fighting back by now. Why haven't they issued a statement?" Callum frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Because they're not fighting back. They're covering their tracks." Mara stopped pacing, her stomach sinking. "You think they're erasing the evidence?" Callum nodded grimly. "It's the only explanation. They're using SpecterNet to wipe everything before anyone can get to it." Mara's hands clenched into fists. "Then we're back to square one. If they erase everything, we have nothing." Before Callum could respond, Mara's phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read it. "Check the news in 10 minutes. Z." Mara's eyes widened. "It's Zeke. He's doing something." Callum leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Mara said, her voice trembling. "But he just sent me a message. He said to check the news." Exactly 10 minutes later, the news broke. Every major outlet began reporting on a massive data leak from Arctis Systems. Files that had supposedly been erased were suddenly appearing online, accessible to journalists, investigators, and the public. The files included everything: SpectreNet's source code, internal memos, financial records, and more. It was a complete and total exposure of the company's wrongdoing. Mara stared at the screen in disbelief. "He did it," she whispered. "Zeke did it." Callum leaned back in his chair, a rare smile crossing his face. He didn't just expose them, he destroyed them. At Arctis headquarters, chaos reigned. The CEO stood in the middle of the conference room, shouting orders at his team. "How is this happening? We erased everything!" One of the IT technicians looked up from his terminal, his face pale. "It's SpectreNet, sir. Someone activated a restoration protocol. All the data we deleted, it's coming back." The CEO's face turned red with fury. "Who? Who did this?" The technician hesitated, then said, It's Zeke Hawthorne. He built this into the system. He's undoing everything." The CEO slammed his fist on the table. "Find him. Stop him. Do whatever it takes." But it was too late. The damage was done. SpectreNet had turned against its creators, and the truth was finally out. The air in Callum's office was electric with tension. Mara sat at the edge of her seat, her eyes glued to the screen of Callum's laptop. On it, a secure connection had been established with a team of federal investigators. The files Zeke had restored through his hidden code were now in the hands of the authorities, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. SpectreNet, the weapon Arctis systems had used to manipulate and destroy lives, was finally exposed. "This is it," Callum said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We have everything we need. The restoration protocol Zeke activated has brought back every piece of data Arctis tried to erase. Now it's up to us to make sure it's used." One of the investigators on the screen, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded. "We've reviewed the files. The evidence is overwhelming. SpectreNet's logs show a clear pattern of data manipulation, fabricated evidence, and targeted attacks on individuals. This isn't just corporate corruption. It's criminal conspiracy on a massive scale." Mara leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hope. "And Zeke, you can see he was framed, right? The logs prove it." The investigator nodded again. "Yes, the logs showed that Zeke's credentials were used to plant the fabricated evidence, but the activity originated from within Arctis's own servers. He's innocent. There's no question about it." Mara let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. Callum, ever the pragmatist, cut in. "What's the next step?" The investigator's expression hardened. "We're moving in on Arctis now. Arrest warrants have been issued for the company's top executives, including the CEO. We're also freezing their assets and securing their servers to prevent any further tampering. As for SpectreNet, we'll need your help to fully disable it." Callum nodded. "Zeke's code should have already neutralized its core functions, but I'll work with your team to ensure it's completely shut down. This system can't be allowed to exist." Mara glanced at Callum, her voice quiet but firm. "And Zeke? How long until he's released?" The investigator hesitated for a moment before replying. "We'll expedite the process, but it will take a few days to formally clear his name and process his release. In the meantime, we'll make sure he's informed of what's happening." Mara's hands clenched into fists. "He's been in there long enough. Please, don't let this take any longer than it has to." The investigator gave her a sympathetic look. "We'll do everything we can." At Arctis Systems headquarters, chaos had erupted. Federal agents swarmed the building, their presence sending employees into a panic. The CEO, flanked by his legal team, tried to maintain an air of control, but it was clear he was losing his grip. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice sharp as he addressed the lead agent. "You have no right to be here." The agent, a tall man with a calm but authoritative demeanor, held up a warrant. "We have every right. We have evidence of your company's involvement in criminal activities, including data manipulation, fraud, and conspiracy. You're under arrest." The CEO's face turned red with fury. "This is absurd. Do you know who I am? Do you know what this company means to the economy?" The agent didn't flinch. "What this company means is irrelevant. What you've done is illegal. Cuff him." As the CEO was led away in handcuffs, other agents began seizing servers, hard drives, and documents. The once impenetrable fortress of Arctis Systems was crumbling, and there was nothing its leaders could do to stop it. Back in Callum's office, Mara watched the news coverage with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Images of Arctis executives being escorted out of their headquarters in handcuffs filled the screen, accompanied by headlines like Corporate Giant Arctis Systems Exposed in Massive Scandal and SpecterNet, the secret weapon that destroyed lives. They're finally getting what they deserve, Mara said, her voice quiet but resolute. Callum nodded, his expression thoughtful. This is just the beginning. The fallout from this will be massive. Lawsuits, criminal trials, regulatory overhauls. Arctis won't recover from this. Mara's thoughts drifted to Zeke. I just want him to be free. He's been through so much. Callum gave her a reassuring look. He will be. The evidence is irrefutable. It's only a matter of time now. 3 days later, Mara stood outside the gates of the federal prison, her heart pounding. She had barely slept since the news broke, her mind consumed with thoughts of Zeke. She had spent every waking moment pushing the authorities to expedite his release, and now, finally, the day had come. The gates creaked open, and a small group of people emerged. At the center of them was Zeke, his hands no longer bound, his face weary but determined. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she saw him. He looked thinner, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes still held the spark of the man she knew. Zeke, she called, running toward him. Zeke's head snapped up, and when he saw her, a smile broke across his face. Mara, she threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. You're free, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You're finally free. Zeke hugged her back, his voice soft but steady. Thanks to you. I don't even know how to thank you. Mara pulled back, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. You don't have to thank me. I couldn't let them get away with what they did to you. Zeke smiled, his expression filled with gratitude. You didn't just save me. You exposed the truth. You brought down Arctis. Mara shook her head. I didn't do it alone. Callum, the investigators, and you're the one who made it possible. That code you wrote, it was brilliant. Zeke chuckled softly. I always knew SpecterNet could be turned against them. I just didn't think I'd ever get the chance to do it. Mara smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. Well, you did. And now, the whole world knows the truth. Later that evening, Zeke, Mara, and Callum sat together in Callum's office, going over the aftermath of the case. The news was still dominated by the Arctis scandal, with new revelations coming to light every hour. The company's stock had plummeted, lawsuits were piling up, and its top executives were facing decades in prison. This is just the beginning, Callum said, leaning back in his chair. The fallout from this will reshape the tech industry. Companies won't be able to operate in the shadows like this anymore. Zeke nodded, his expression thoughtful. Good. No one should have to go through what I did. Mara reached over and placed a hand on his arm. You're free now, Zeke. That's what matters. Zeke looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah, I am, and it's thanks to you. Callum cleared his throat, a rare smile crossing his face. Don't forget, you've got a lot of people rooting for you now. The public sees you as a hero, Zeke. You exposed one of the biggest corporate scandals in history. Zeke shook his head. I'm no hero. I just wanted the truth to come out. Mara squeezed his arm. Well, you did it, and now you can finally start over. Zeke looked at her, his smile growing. Yeah, I think I can. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zeke felt a sense of peace. The fight was over, the truth was out, and he was free. It was time to rebuild his life, and he knew he wouldn't have to do it alone. The heavy iron gates of the prison creaked open, their sound echoing in the crisp morning air. Zeke stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sunlight hit his face, warm and blinding after so many months behind cold, gray walls. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The open sky, the fresh air, the sense of freedom that felt almost surreal. And then he saw them. Mara stood a few feet away, her face lighting up the moment their eyes met. Beside her, Ragnar barked excitedly, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might fall off. Zeke's breath caught in his throat as he took a step forward, then another, until he was running toward them. Ragnar, he called, his voice breaking with emotion. The dog bolted toward him, leaping into his arms with a joyful bark. Zeke dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Ragnar's neck and burying his face in the dog's fur. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. It was just him and Ragnar, the loyal companion who had been his only source of comfort during the darkest days of his life. You're a good boy, Zeke whispered, his voice trembling. You never gave up on me, did you? Ragnar licked his face, his tail wagging furiously. Zeke laughed, a sound that felt foreign after so many months of silence and despair. He held Ragnar close, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. Mara approached slowly, giving them a moment before speaking. "Welcome back, Zeke," she said softly. Zeke looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He stood, still holding Ragnar's leash, and pulled Mara into a hug. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Mara hugged him back tightly. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone who cares about you would do." Zeke pulled back, looking at her with a small, grateful smile. "You did more than that. You believed in me when no one else did. You fought for me. I'll never forget that." Mara smiled, her eyes shining. "You deserved the truth to come out, Zeke, and now it has." Behind her, Callum stepped forward, his usual composed demeanor softened by a rare smile. "Good to see you on the outside, Zeke." Zeke extended a hand, but Callum shook his head and pulled him into a brief, firm hug instead. "You earned this," Callum said. "You fought back, even when the odds were stacked against you. That takes strength." Zeke chuckled, shaking his head. "I couldn't have done it without you. You and Mara, you gave me hope when I didn't have any left." Callum nodded, his expression serious. "Well, you gave us the tools to make it happen. That code you wrote, it was genius. You didn't just save yourself, Zeke. You exposed something that's going to change the way the world looks at companies like Arctis." Zeke's smile faded slightly as he looked down at Ragnar, who was now sitting obediently at his feet. "It's not just about me," he said quietly. "Arctis hurt so many people. They destroyed lives, ruined careers, all for their own gain. I can't just walk away from that." Mara tilted her head, studying him. "What do you mean?" Zeke looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "I mean, I can't go back to the way things were. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. There are other companies out there like Arctis, using technology to manipulate and control people. I have the skills to fight back, to expose them. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Callum raised an eyebrow, a hint of admiration in his expression. "That's a noble goal, Zeke, but it's not going to be easy. Companies like Arctis have deep pockets and powerful connections. They won't go down without a fight." Zeke nodded. "I know, but I've already been through the worst. I've lost everything once before. I'm not afraid of them anymore." Mara smiled, a spark of pride in her eyes. "You're not alone in this, Zeke. Whatever you decide to do, I'll be there to help," Ragnar barked, as if to echo her sentiment. Zeke laughed, reaching down to scratch the dog behind his ears. "Looks like I've got a team already." Callum crossed his arms, a thoughtful look on his face. "If you're serious about this, I might be able to help. I know people, journalists, investigators, even a few whistleblowers. If you're going to take on the tech giants, you'll need allies." Zeke looked at him, surprised. "You'd help me? Even after everything we've been through?" Callum smirked. "Let's just say I have a soft spot for underdogs. And besides, taking down corrupt corporations is kind of my specialty." Zeke grinned. "Then I guess we've got a lot of work to do." Later that evening, Zeke, Mara, and Ragnar sat on a park bench overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting the skyline in hues of orange and gold. Ragnar lay at Zeke's feet, his head resting on his paws, while Mara leaned back, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. "It feels strange," Zeke said after a long silence. "Being free. For so long I thought I'd never see the outside world again." Mara glanced at him, her expression soft. "You're free now, Zeke. You can do whatever you want, go wherever you want." Zeke nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but I don't think I can just move on. Not yet. There's too much work to be done." Mara smiled. "You've always been like that? Always thinking about the bigger picture?" Zeke chuckled. "Guess I can't help it. But this time it's different. This time, I know what I'm fighting for." Mara reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, you're not alone. You've got me, Ragnar, and even Callum in his own grumpy way." Zeke laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Yeah, I guess I do." The two of them sat in comfortable silence, watching as the city lights began to twinkle in the distance. For the first time in a long time, Zeke felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let what happened to him happen to anyone else. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Zeke reached down to pat Ragnar's head. "Ready for the next adventure, boy?" Ragnar barked softly, his tail wagging. Mara smiled. "Looks like he's ready." Zeke stood, stretching his arms and looking out at the city. "Then let's get to work." With Ragnar at his side and Mara by his shoulder, Zeke took his first steps into his new life. a life dedicated to justice, truth, and making sure that no one else would ever be silenced by the power of greed and corruption. The world had changed in the months since Zeke's release. His story had spread far and wide, becoming a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the unyielding power of truth. News outlets, podcasts, and documentaries chronicled his journey, from a wrongfully accused programmer to the man who brought down one of the most powerful corporations in the tech industry. But it wasn't just Zeke who captured the public's imagination. Ragnar, his loyal dog, had become a hero in his own right. Images of Ragnar, his intelligent eyes, his wagging tail, his unwavering loyalty, were everywhere. People called him the dog who saved justice, and children's books were even being written about him. Zeke couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Ragnar didn't care about fame or recognition. All he wanted was to be by Zeke's side, and that was enough for both of them. Zeke stood in front of a packed auditorium, the bright lights shining down on him. The room was filled with journalists, activists, and supporters who had come to hear him speak at the launch of his new nonprofit organization. Mara and Callum sat in the front row, Ragnar lying at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Zeke adjusted the microphone, his voice steady as he began. A year ago, I was sitting in a prison cell wondering if I'd ever see the outside world again. I was framed for a crime I didn't commit, betrayed by a system I thought I could trust. But I wasn't alone. I had people who believed in me, who fought for me, and who refused to let the truth stay buried. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. There are countless others out there, people who have been silenced, manipulated, and destroyed by corporations that think they're untouchable. That's why we're here today, to fight back, to protect those who can't protect themselves, to make sure that no one else has to go through what I did. The audience erupted into applause, but Zeke wasn't finished. He gestured toward Mara and Callum. This organization wouldn't exist without the people who stood by me. Mara, who never stopped believing in me, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming. Callum, who used his expertise to expose the truth and hold those responsible accountable. And of course, he looked down at Ragnar, who perked up at the sound of his name. Ragnar, my best friend and the most loyal companion anyone could ask for. The crowd laughed and clapped as Ragnar barked, his tail wagging furiously. Zeke smiled, his heart full. This isn't just my story, it's our story, and it's just the beginning. After the event, Zeke, Mara, and Callum gathered in the small office space they had rented for their nonprofit, which they had named Beacon Initiative, a nod to Zeke's hidden failsafe that had exposed Arctis. The office was modest but functional, with desks, computers, and a large whiteboard covered in notes and ideas. Callum leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. Well, that went better than I expected. You've got the public on your side, Zeke. That's a powerful thing. Mara nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. We've already had dozens of people reach out, whistleblowers, victims, even former employees of Arctis who want to help. This is bigger than we ever imagined. Zeke sat in his chair, Ragnar lying at his feet. He reached down to scratch the dog's ears, his mind racing with possibilities. It's a start, he said, but we have a long way to go. The tech industry is full of companies like Arctis. They might not all have something as dangerous as SpecterNet, but they're still exploiting people, manipulating data, and abusing their power. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Callum smirked. You sound like a man on a mission. Zeke looked up, his expression serious. I am. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. Mara smiled, leaning forward. And you're not doing it alone. We're in this together. Ragnar barked softly as if to agree. Zeke laughed, reaching down to pat his head. Looks like Ragnar's on board too. Over the next few months, the Beacon Initiative grew rapidly. They took on their first cases, helping individuals who had been wrongfully accused or targeted by powerful corporations. Callum's legal expertise, Mara's investigative skills, and Zeke's technical knowledge made them a formidable team. Ragnar, of course, became the unofficial mascot of the organization, his presence bringing comfort and inspiration to everyone who walked through their doors. One of their first victories came when they helped a small-town journalist expose a data manipulation scheme by a major social media company. The case made headlines, further cementing the Beacon Initiative's reputation as a force to be reckoned with. Zeke couldn't help but feel a sense of pride every time they won a case, knowing they were making a real difference. But it wasn't just about the victories. It was about the people they were helping, the whistleblowers who finally had a voice, the victims who finally had justice, and the communities that were finally being protected from corporate greed. For Zeke, It was a way to turn his pain into purpose, to take the worst experience of his life and use it to create something good. One evening, Zeke sat in the office alone, going over a new case file. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the computer and the occasional rustle of papers. Ragnar lay beside him, his head resting on Zeke's foot. Zeke leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of him, Mara, Callum, and Ragnar, taken on the day they officially launched the Beacon Initiative. They were all smiling, their faces filled with hope and determination. Zeke couldn't help but smile as he looked at it. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" he said, glancing down at Ragnar. Ragnar lifted his head, his ears perking up at the sound of Zeke's voice. He wagged his tail, his eyes bright and alert. Zeke reached down to scratch behind Ragnar's ears. "You never gave up on me. Even when things were at their worst, you were there. I don't know how I would have made it without you." Ragnar barked softly as if to say, "I was just doing my job." Zeke chuckled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "We did it, Ragnar. We made it through. And now, we're making a difference." He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the city lights. The road ahead was still long, and there would be challenges to come, but for the first time in a long time, Zeke felt at peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, fighting, and building something that mattered. As Ragnar settled back down at his feet, Zeke smiled and said softly, "We've done it, my friend. We've done it." Ragnar wagged his tail and let out a happy bark, as if he understood every word. And in that moment, Zeke knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together.